You're joking. Really? Seriously, it's not a wind-up, is it?
Oh my God, this is amazing. Thank you.
The next winning call could be answered by you. For a chance to win £20,000 in tax-free cash, text WIN to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. Or post your name and number to GB05 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 31st of May. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
We're GB News, and we come from a proud tradition of British journalism.
That's why I'm so excited to be here. It's something so new.
The first news channel to be launched in Britain in over 30 years.
Launched to represent the views of the British people.
To go where other broadcasters refuse to go.
How did you find out about the story in the first place?
Launched with one aim.
To be the fearless champion of Britain.
It's an absolutely fantastic atmosphere here.
This is GB News.
The People's Channel. GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News is the home of free speech. We were created to champion it, and we deliver it day in, day out.
Free speech allows us all to explore and debate openly the issues most important to us, our families, and of course, the British people.
Having challenging conversations to enlighten each other.
Which is why we hear all sides of the argument.
We are the People's Channel.
We will always stand by the freedom to express yourself.
On TV, radio and online.
This is GB News,
Britain's news channel.
GB News is Britain's election channel. And from tonight,
the people decide.
As the country heads to the polls in a rush of elections.
We'll take you through the night as the first results come in.
And we'll pick up at breakfast
with the very best guests and analysis.
And on the weekend, the results won't stop, and neither will we.
We'll explore what it all means for you as we look ahead to the general election.
Continuing coverage live from tonight at midnight on GB News.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. Johnny Mercer has said he would sooner go to prison than give up the names of the SAS whistleblowers to the Afghan inquiry. But surely people should be able to speak to MPs confidentially as they can to a lawyer or a journalist. The OECD has made a gloomy forecast of Britain's economic future. And no, it's not because of Brexit, it's because of the Bank of England's insistence on high interest rates and the overtaxing of British people. As the college campus anti-Israel protests reach fever pitch, the cacophony has spilled over into the UK, with protest camps being set up across Britain in universities. But will we see the same degree of disorder? Plus, a teacher who has been banned from his profession after misgendering a student has taken his case to the High Court. I'll be speaking to the man himself tonight. State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by my most intellectual panel this evening, GB News' senior political commentator Nigel Nelson and the journalist and Conservative peer Paul Goodman. As always, as you know, I want to hear from you. It's a crucial part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's what you've all been waiting for, the News Bulletin with Sam Francis.
Jacob, thank you, and good evening to you. It's 8 o'clock, and the top story from the newsroom tonight is that more than 700 migrants arrived in the UK today after crossing the Channel in a single day, a new record for the year so far. Home Office figures show 711 people made the journey in 14 boats on Wednesday, suggesting an average of 51 people per boat. It brings the total number who've made the crossing since January to nearly now 8,300. That's up 34% compared to the same time last year. We've heard tonight that a third man has been charged with assisting illegal immigration after 5 migrants, including a 7-year-old girl, died trying to cross the Channel last week. The defendant from Sudan was reported to be 23 years old, but during his court appearance today, he claimed to be a minor. It comes after 2 other men were also charged over that incident, and they too claimed they were 15 and 16 years old. But initial assessments by immigration officers placed them in their 20s. Meanwhile, police have arrested 45 people after a large group of protesters blocked a coach to stop it from leaving with migrants on board. Footage showed officers surrounding the bus and removing several protesters while others joined the demonstrations sitting in the road. The bus was supposed to take 7 migrants, we understand, to the Bibby Stockholm barge in Dorset, but eventually left without them on board. Downing Street's called the protests as unacceptable. A samurai sword attacker has appeared in court today, charged with the murder of a 14-year-old schoolboy in north-east London. Daniel Angerin was fatally stabbed on Tuesday morning as he made his way to school. Marcos Monzo, a Spanish-Brazilian dual national, is also charged with 2 counts of attempted murder and injuring 4 other people when he broke into a house where a family was sleeping. The 36-year-old's been remanded in custody and is next due to appear at the Old Bailey. Well, voters are continuing to head to the polls tonight in a series of local elections in many parts of England and Wales. Seats are up for grabs on 107 local authorities, while there are also votes for mayors, some police commissioners, and there's a by-election in Blackpool South. Voting's due to end at 10 o'clock tonight, and there will, of course, be full coverage and analysis right through the night here on GB News. The government, meanwhile, has apologised to veterans today after some were turned away from polling stations because their veteran card wasn't on the official list of acceptable IDs. Veterans Minister Johnny Mercer has vowed to do all he can to make sure veteran ID cards are added to the list of valid identification. However, Labour says the government's had years to make sure the cards were included. Today's elections are the first time that many voters in England and Wales have had to present ID to vote. And finally, before we hand back to Jacob in Westminster, to the US, where President Joe Biden has called for order on college campuses after violent clashes between police and protesters. In California, hundreds of riot police moved in on pro-Palestine protesters at UCLA campus in Los Angeles. Police there say they've made hundreds of arrests during their crackdowns. And meanwhile, in the UK, students have also set up sit-in camps in protest against Israel's war with Hamas. Students in Sheffield, in Leeds, Newcastle and in Bristol set up tents outside campus buildings. Organisers now suggest those demonstrations could spread across the rest of the UK. That's the latest from the newsroom. More at 9 o'clock. Until then, you can sign up to GB News Alerts. Just scan the code there on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Welcome back to State of the Nation. The Afghan inquiry has set a deadline of next week by when the Veterans Minister, Johnny Mercer, must reveal the names of the SAS whistleblowers who gave him sensitive information in confidence about the alleged murders of innocent people in Afghanistan. But today, The Times reported that sources close to Mercer have said he would be willing to go to prison before disclosing the names of the whistleblowers. In February, Mr. Mercer, a former officer, told the inquiry that Special Forces soldiers had raised concerns with him about alleged executions of innocent civilians in Afghanistan, as well as other concerning information regarding the mistreatment of Afghans. The inquiry chairman, the very distinguished Lord Justice Haddon Cave, ordered Mercer to reveal their names, promising to protect their anonymity. But Mercer refused. Mercer was then told he had a deadline of the 5th of April or face a prison sentence. But the deadline has now been extended until next week. But this is a troubling case about the balance between the judiciary and Parliament. Our Constitution works on a balance between the two. As a rule, MPs are answerable in civil matters to their constituents, not to the courts, and historically are exempt from civil but not criminal arrest. And much in the same way that when a defendant confides in his lawyer, or when a source confides in a journalist, a whistleblower has the reasonable expectation of anonymity when giving sensitive information to a member of Parliament. It is extremely rare that a journalist or a lawyer would have to hand over the names of sources of sensitive information. And I think the same should apply here. If these names were to be given to the inquiry, it would discourage other whistleblowers from coming forward. But on a more fundamental level, Parliament is the highest authority in the land, higher than the courts, because its representative of the people. A move like this would discourage anyone from giving sensitive or possibly vital information to a Member of Parliament who may be able to do his job better with such knowledge. As ever, let me know your thoughts, mailmog@gbnews.com. And I'm joined now by a friend of the programme, legal consultant in human rights, Fadi Farhat. Fadi, thank you very much for coming in. This is a very interesting issue because the allegations are tremendously serious, and it is important that we find out if people were murdered by British armed forces, and that's what the inquiry is doing. But is it right that the judge should then appear to have this power to extract information from someone?
Well, when this matter first broke out, Jacob, back in March, and I remember referring to the Inquiries Act 2005, and I had a look at Section 21, which provides the chairman powers to make a notice under that section. And broadly, there are three broad provisions. One is to give evidence, the power to compel to give evidence or to provide evidence in written form. And two is to provide any documents in one's custody, or three, to provide or produce anything in one's custody. This isn't a document. The names of the SAS officers are information. Mm-hmm. So it's not a document or a thing in one's custody. And so it can only be, the power can only apply to the power to give evidence or to produce evidence. And in my view, that may not, arguably, may not extend to compel to give evidence and dictate the content of that evidence. John Mercer has already given his evidence as to what was said to him, and it's questionable whether the power then extends to compel him to produce evidence and dictate the content of that evidence, which is what he's being told to do by producing the names.
I see. So there's at least an argument that though you can compel somebody to give evidence, you can't compel the extent of that evidence. Indeed. As long as what they say is true in the evidence that they give.
That seems to be a plausible interpretation on the wording of Section 21, and Parliament may have intended that to at least provide evidence, but not to dictate or the extent of that evidence.
And in what I hope is the unlikely eventuality that Johnny Mercer were to be sent to prison, how would that function? Would he go for trial before jury, or would it be the unilateral action of a judge?
The Act says that under Section 35 that the chairman could institute proceedings or start proceedings, and it's and one's liable for summary conviction up to 51 weeks imprisonment. That's that. But inbuilt in Section 35 is whether you have a reasonable excuse defence.
Yes.
So even in the event of a breach, one could still present the reasonable excuse defence. And John Mercer has already pointed to the fact that his reasonable excuse is that there are public interest considerations in not divulging the names, as well as the officers being vulnerable or the officers being susceptible to reprisals or their family members. So there are wider issues that he could point to in providing that reasonable excuse defence.
And there are other people who have an interest in this, aren't there? I mentioned journalists and lawyers because, as a general but not absolute principle, journalists can protect their sources and lawyers do not have to sneak on their clients.
Yes.
And this is fundamental to a democratic society with free speech and the rule of law.
Indeed, indeed. And to public inquiries, which is what this is, because John Mercer's provided his evidence and we've obtained valuable information from that. If officers were to... If the president were to be said that you're going to be named, or there's a risk of that, in future officers may not come forward, and the evidence that John Mercer's provided to the inquiry would not be given in future.
And it changes...
Because he wouldn't have the information.
He wouldn't have the information.
Yes.
You wouldn't say that you'd got the information and you wouldn't get it because people wouldn't come to you.
Indeed.
And this, for members of Parliament, is, I think, a real problem to how our constitution works, because people come to their MP week in, week out, with an expectation that their conversation will be confidential and that it won't be passed on and that it informs the Member of Parliament, and they may then want the MP to do something, but that it won't be revealed to somebody else.
Yes, exactly. But ultimately, the answer or solution to this problem will be from Parliament, because Parliament can clarify the powers under Section 21 because that's these powers are not inherent. They stem from the Inquiries Act 2005, and it's open to Parliament to amend that and clarify the provisions.
And that would be better than getting into the very complex constitutional grounds of whether you can imprison a member of Parliament in these circumstances, because it's always very straightforward that if a member of Parliament breaks the criminal law, murders somebody or any of that sort of thing, there is no exemption for MPs, and there almost never has been in our history. But MPs have always been protected against civil actions to stop them being arrested in civil cases.
Yes.
And this is in something of a grey area, isn't it, between the two?
Indeed, we are entering this dark, labyrinthine corner of our constitution. And I think the solution would be for Parliament to clarify the Inquiries Act rather than necessarily enter into that area. But it's a very interesting area as it is, yes.
Well,
ultimately will need to be resolved one way or another.
I find these corners of the Constitution absolutely fascinating, but I may be in a minority in that. How much discretion does the judge have in terms of the inquiry? Could he simply decide that it is not in the public interest to proceed and drop the request for evidence? Or having gone this far, is he in some sense obliged to carry on?
No. So Section 35 appears to provide that discretion. So even in the event of a breach, the discretion is that the chairman has a broad discretion whether to institute proceedings for what is quasi-contempt almost.
And I suppose the case for where he's gone so far is that actually finding out if things went wrong in Afghanistan in the way that's been suggested is really very important, because as a nation we've always prided ourselves for generations on proper behaviour in war. That's not to say that war isn't horrible and cruel and doesn't kill people, but that we have abided by the rules of war, and that in trying to find out or allegations that hasn't happened, that is a serious matter that needs proper investigation.
Indeed, yes, that is a serious matter that needs investigation. On the other hand, perhaps revealing the names would then enable the public inquiry, to call the officers with safeguards, and therefore use that as a platform to extract more information from which we can draw lessons. But the other side of the argument is that John Mercer's probably provided that already.
Having as a third party.
Yes, and all you're going to have is then duplication, which is unnecessary.
Fadi, thank you very much for coming in. I'm particularly grateful for Fadi because initially we told him we were going to talk about a completely different subject, and he's shown his legal flexibility. Coming up, the OECD has forecast slovenly growth, with the UK being the worst performer of the G7 next year. But will the Bank of England do the right thing next week and cut interest rates? And will the High Court side with the teacher who refused to use preferred gender pronouns? I'll be speaking to the man himself shortly.
Dubes & Co. Weekdays from 6 p.m.
You think this country needs new gas power stations? Apparently, this will all be about trying to get some form of energy security. Rishi Sunak has upset people today with this suggestion, people saying that actually this would do more damage to climate change than it would do good. Where are you on it, Richard?
I'll tell you exactly where. We need a lot more gas power stations and nuclear power stations, because quite often the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. Last week, we imported 16% of all our electricity because we haven't got enough capacity in the UK, and we're now totally over-reliant on renewables.
The part of the problem is the lack of storage capacity, which the government has finally got round to addressing. I think this as backup is actually quite a sensible idea. But they are not doing anything, as far as I can tell. At the moment, it will be retrofitted to have storage capability, which seems to be utterly bonkers. I mean, anyone who's got solar panels, you know very well you're storing up energy. So it's about storage as much as production. They could have gone, 20 years ago, we could have had nuclear power. We could have done more. We haven't looked far enough ahead in the future, and we are in grave danger of making the same mistake. I mean, the other side of this is, what is the difference going to be? Blackouts are you know, they're irritating and...
Irritating? It'd be disastrous. It would
they
literally destroy
would be
our
now.
economy.
Well, they would be now, but, you know, some of us remember 3-day weeks and things like that. And in fact, you know, I grew up thinking that everybody had, you know, at least a couple of days a week when they had to eat off a primer stove and things.
This is, again, I don't want to harp on, but this is one of the problems in the politics in our country, isn't it? So many politicians, they just think in election cycles.
Absolutely.
They just think, what can I do and say to get my own backside re-elected at the next general election? They're not always looking ahead at, actually, politics aside, what is genuinely the best thing for this country.
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK,
GB News brings you accurate reporting of the day's topical agenda.
When the news breaks, wherever and whenever it's happening,
we'll be there.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And why it matters to you. From your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you. Good afternoon, Britain. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Weekdays on GB News. Wake up to breakfast every day from 6 a.m. Followed by Britain's newsroom at 9:30. At noon, it's Good Afternoon Britain. Followed by Martin Daubney from 3 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. The Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, has revised its forecasts for G7 economies, and it has painted a gloomy picture for the United Kingdom. The UK is now projected to be the second slowest growing economy in the G7 for 2024, ahead of Germany, and the slowest of the entire G7 in 2025. But while many of these international institutions are known to be Brexit-bashing, Britain-hating and dominated by bureaucratic liberal groupthink, the OECD has cited fiscal and monetary policies for its revisions. The new report said high personal income taxes and high interest rates are having a seriously negative effect on economic growth, but also, crucially, that mass migration has marked our entrenched economic problems. Well, I'm joined now by my panel, GB News' senior political commentator, Nigel Nelson, and the journalist and Conservative peer, Paul Goodman. Nigel, the OECD has basically said we should cut taxes and have lower interest rates. Is that a good idea?
The OECD has also said we won't hit the 2% inflation target until 2026.
I think that's very unlikely to be true.
Well, I mean, that's what they're saying.
Yeah,
it's in the report. So
yes.
On the basis of that, that means interest rates can't come down to the level that we wanted them to. They'll probably drop, but they still can't come down to a lower level until we get to that stage. And so when it comes to cutting taxes, we're back to the problem here, which is priorities. Do we have decent public services? Do we pay for the mistakes we've made, the infected blood scandal, the waspy women, which everyone has got remarkably quiet about, I've noticed since the...
Yes, well, the Labour Party has gone very quiet.
Yeah, they don't want to pay for it either.
Pay for it,
I mean, no one's keen to pay for it, but it's still out there. And if you're considering tax cuts and things like that, I'd rather see us do something on public services, more on the NHS, and to correct those mistakes.
And Paul, it seems to me, just on the point of 2% inflation, not until 2026, that's just fundamentally unlikely.
Well, I mean, first of all, the OECD, it's rather more gloomy than some of the other institutions, and some people predict better and some people predict worse. Actually, our growth compared to some other countries over quite a long period of time hasn't been too bad. But I think for your viewers watching this who've had a very hard time in recent years, the situation is pretty bleak, and I don't think it can be corrected, as we found out, I'm afraid, under the Truss experiment, simply by cutting taxes and letting everything else go. The fact is, we need a sustained, serious, long-term plan to reconstruct the economy, and that doesn't just mean cutting taxes. It means getting some grip on our spending, on our colossal debt.
Well, I agree with that. I think that we need to get control of expenditure. We need to move away from this idea, which you were sort of hinting at, that public spending is in itself a good thing. It's only good if the money is spent well.
Well, tax cuts are a good thing.
Tax cuts are always a good thing.
No, tax cuts are a good thing sometimes, but what I was talking about was where your priorities lie when you've got a finite amount of money. We want to spend 2.5% on defence. We've got to find 75 billion for that.
And ultimately, this is where Liz Truss was right. It's about growing the economy.
We agree with that, yeah.
And how do you get there?
Right.
And that seems to me, as Paul was indicating, a number of other steps. You can't just leave everything as is and cut taxes, otherwise your deficit balloons and the debt gets out of control. You need to look at restructuring the economy. And what's interesting about these OECD figures is that it's consistently the US and Canada that are doing reasonably well, and European nations are doing badly. They seem to have locked themselves in to being low-growth economies.
We all agree that economic growth is a good thing, and that is the way to get Britain out of the doldrums. I would say it would be something like, I regret that Labour won't spend the 28 billion they promised to on their green projects. That has the potential to give us £1 trillion worth of extra business for Britain by 2030. And you're looking very sceptical.
I don't believe that for a moment.
Well, you may not believe it, but it's what Jeremy Hunt said and Grant Shapps said in their green fiscal strategy last year.
But the green fiscal strategy is nonsense. That actually, what is it that the European states have had that the US hasn't is very high energy costs. And so we're, 44 cents per kilowatt hour of electricity against 17 cents in the US. And that's been one of the biggest things holding back our
I'm very
economy.
doubtful about the prospect you can simply spend your way to success. And we have to think about not just how we're going to fund the NHS tomorrow, but how we're going to fund it the day after tomorrow and the day after that. And that means having your tax policy in line with your spending policy, which means, I'm afraid, yet more painful choices coming down the line for all European countries. You're quite right about that, about the problems Europe faces compared to America.
So what sort of choices are you talking about?
Well, in America, they've got a reasonably buoyant population. Here, we've got a demographic problem. We either have to import our labour or cut our spending or simply work longer. And there's a point at which we won't be willing to work longer, and where there's resistance to immigration. At that point, you have to start looking at the third of your public spending that goes on health and pensions.
And the OECD is saying that our growth, such as we've had, is from very high levels of migration, which everybody's now committed to cutting. Now, I think, again, that's not a very good analysis, because that has led to GDP per capita falling, which is what people are more concerned about.
Yes, it's what you've got, yes. And I'm not sure, again, I mean, legal immigration should work on the basis of the economic need of the country. I don't mind cutting it to tens of thousands if that's what Britain needs, but if not, don't put a figure on it. And all we're doing at the moment is reversing Tory policies, such as we're encouraging students into this country. We wanted 600,000 students by 2030 to pay for the universities. Now we want to discourage them. What's going to happen is tuition fees will go up.
And that's one of the difficult choices that Paul was alluding to, that you can either have your university subsidised by foreign students who pay very high rates, or you can get domestic students to pay more.
Sooner or later, the main parties are going to have to grapple with that, because, yes, you either do that or you end up, I'm afraid, closing universities and closing places.
So it may be that the 50% target isn't realistic.
It may be so.
It may be so. Well, thank you very much to my panel. Coming up, the pro-Palestine cacophony from US college campuses has spilled over into the UK. But will the police deal with those breaking the law as they should? And should teachers have the right to resist the tyranny of gender ideology? I'll be speaking to a man on the front line of this battle.
Good evening. It's time for your latest GB News weather update, brought to you by the Met Office. There's going to be quite a bit of rain around tomorrow, but before then, the risk of some heavy thundery downpours overnight, in association with a front that's still lingering across central parts at the moment, and we do still have some blustery conditions because of an area of low pressure over the near continent. But I think it's the thundery downpours across central parts of England into Wales where we're most likely to see any issues. Some of the showery rain will continue as we go overnight, and we'll likely see a few bursts pushing in from the North Sea further north as well, but many areas towards the northwest of the UK staying dry, some clear skies, but for most a relatively mild start to the day tomorrow. As we go through tomorrow itself, then more rain to come across central parts of England, Wales, and some showers across northern England and into southern Scotland too. Some of these could be heavy and thundery. Lots of cloud and showery rain continuing across many areas, but towards the far north and the far south of the UK, we should have some decent dry and sunny weather. In the sunshine, it will feel quite warm, albeit temperatures not quite as high as they were today. As we look towards the weekend, and well, it is looking pretty messy. On Saturday, there's going to be quite a bit of cloud and outbreaks of showery rain across the northern half of the UK before some showery stuff is likely to push its way up from the south as we go through the day, and that could be heavy, possibly even thundery. More mixed weather to come as we go through Sunday into Monday. There will be some drier, brighter weather at times, but also plenty of showers as well. I'll see you again soon.
GB News is the home of free speech. We were created to champion it, and we deliver it day in, day out.
Free speech allows us all to explore and debate openly the issues most important to us, our families, and of course, the British people.
Having challenging conversations to enlighten each other.
Which is why we hear all sides of the argument.
We are the People's Channel.
We will always stand by the freedom to express yourself.
On TV, radio and online.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News is Britain's election channel. And from tonight,
the people decide.
As the country heads to the polls in a rush of elections.
We'll take you through the night as the first results come in.
And we'll pick up at breakfast
with the very best guests and analysis.
And on the weekend, the results won't stop, and neither will we.
We'll explore what it all means for you as we look ahead to the general election.
Continuing coverage live from tonight at midnight on GB News.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's live here on GB News.
Whenever Parliament is in session on a Wednesday at midday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions. We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Well, we've been talking about Nostradamus, really, and OECD forecasts. Nostradamus was much better at it. Alexander says, Jacob, in light of the new Brexit checks implemented, it's no surprise that the OECD has made such a gloomy forecast. Surely Brexit plays some role here. No, they are not Brexit checks. These are an act of self-harm the government has voluntarily imposed on the border. It is not a consequence of Brexit. It is a choice, and in my view, a moronic one, in case I hadn't been clear yesterday. Philip, please explain why cutting spending would help Britain's economy. Our public services are barely running, mainly because the Tories won't fund them properly. If we want a healthy economy, surely we need public services running. Well, productivity in public services is no higher than it was in 1997. That's the problem with public services. It's not money, it's productivity. Jeff, Jacob, surely it's time to end the independence of the Bank of England. The ostriches have had their time and have failed miserably. Jeff, I think you are absolutely right. Bank of England independence has not worked, and it's costing us a lot. The United States of America, has seen a nationwide phenomenon of pro-Palestine riots erupting across about 30 university campuses, with the police having to step in and making as many as 1,300 arrests. Students have been staging sit-ins with repeated acts of vandalism and disorder. The activists have said they are protesting against their institutions doing business with Israel or companies linked to its military. But some of the protesters have seemingly become so consumed by the cause that they themselves believe they're actually in Gaza. As one of them said to reporters, "Do you want students to die of dehydration and starvation or get severely ill even if they disagree with you? If the answer is no, then you should allow basic, I mean, it's crazy to say because we're on an Ivy League campus, but this is like basic humanitarian aid we're asking for." That's absolutely bonkers, never mind. But it's spilling over into the UK with campus sit-ins occurring across British universities, including at Manchester, Leeds, Bristol and Sheffield. The question is, will we see the same degree of disorder? Well, with me now is my panel, GB News' senior political commentator, Nigel Nelson, and the Conservative peer, Paul Goodman. Paul, why can't we think up our own protests with Black Lives Matters and with this? We've just got to copy the US.
Because it's a psychic epidemic, as a psychologist might put it. It is literally a kind of case of mass hysteria. And I say that without in any way ticking everything that the Israelis are doing in Gaza. But why is it, when we had, I think, up to 300,000 people died in the Syrian civil war, 15,000 dead now in the Sudan, where are the protests? There aren't any. I think the reason for this is it's fundamentally a kind of adolescent protest against authority and Western liberal democracy as represented by Israel in the imagination of these people.
OK, and therefore they have been infected by it, and that's why they talk nonsense about saying that there they are in their rich, wealthy campuses being dehydrated when there's a cafeteria open 20 yards away.
I just keep coming back to the absence of protest about anything else, about all the other evils in the world. Sudan at the moment, where there are terrible massacres going on, or the horrors that happened in the Syrian civil war, nothing like that.
Nothing like that. That's such a good point.
It is a good point.
No one's complaining about the Uyghurs in China.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that I grew up at a time when student protest change things, or at the very least influence change. So 4 million students going on strike in the US against Vietnam, 500,000 marching on Washington. It helped to end the Vietnam War. In France, student protest in Paris managed to get rid of Charles de Gaulle. He fled the country, resigned the following year. So in a sense, I'm quite pleased to see protests coming back again. It can actually achieve something. This one has become such a polarising issue. But if students want to protest, you were very generous about the students who harassed you last week. If students want to protest, that's fine, as long as they continue with their studies and they do it peacefully.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. It's what I said in my own case, that nobody was breaking the law. They were just making a bit of noise.
They were harassing you. There's no question you were being intimidated and harassed.
I wasn't being intimidated by a few people shouting at me. I'm not that wet.
Well, you had 6 security guards around you.
The security was very professional, and they wanted to make sure nothing went wrong. But no, the right of protest means that people can be protested against, and politicians who express their views every night on GB
I think
News
that's really generous.
must be.
We were all defending you on GB News.
No, don't you agree? But the police will find getting this balance right difficult, as they have in the US, where they've waded in quite strongly, because some of the things in the US have definitely gone over into anti-Semitism. Some Jewish people have been injured. And so there is a point at which peaceful protest becomes unpeaceful and illegal.
The students have got every right to protest, just as we've got every right to protest about them protesting. It's when it spills over into violence, or that thing that's on the edge of violence, intimidation, that's a point at which it becomes a matter for the authorities.
Right, they're showing pictures of me being harassed on the screen, or harassed even, on the screen. Now, you see, they're just... Well, I don't have eyes in the back of my head, so I couldn't see all of this when I was getting into the car, but it all just seemed a bit noisy to me, rather than particularly intimidating. And protesting is a fundamental right in a democracy.
It is. I'm just looking at those TV pictures again. Seems to me to be pretty much on the cusp, and we'll be asking, were you on the verge of being hit? Were you on the verge of being assaulted? And the answer is we don't know.
We don't know, and I didn't feel that I was likely to be.
Right.
But what's going on in the US, what point do you say you have to move away camps and things like that? Is that part of legitimate protest, or is that such an inconvenience to other people that you are entitled to move them away?
I don't think the inconvenience is a reason for moving people. I think that what has happened in America is we've ended up with some violence, especially over in California, for instance. That's when the police actually have to intervene. I mean, from a political point of view, this is election year there. Biden relies on the youth vote. What they're doing is maybe symbolic, but it's quite important.
Well, it's very interesting because Biden has come out and said this is hate speech and that everyone needs to calm down. Trump's been obviously Trump-like and said that they're infiltrated by paid agitators and so on. But Biden is potentially disassociating himself from a big chunk of his voters.
Yes, that's right. And that's what I mean about why it's important that this could actually change things, because he's got to look for the youth vote. I mean, these are people who are not going to vote for Trump.
The Democrats would remember there were waves of student protests in 1968. Who won the American presidential election in 1968? Richard Nixon and the Republicans.
Indeed. Well, it's hard to keep up with Donald Trump's legal affairs these days, but on Tuesday it emerged he's been ordered to pay a fine of £7,200 for repeatedly breaching a gag order in his so-called hush money trial. The former president had criticised expected trial witnesses 9 times on social media, despite the gagging order, prompting the judge to threaten incarceration if it were breached again. And while £7,200 is a drop in the ocean compared to Trump's vast wealth, surely the principle of free speech applies, and he should be free to criticise whomsoever he pleases. Well, the president continues in court today, and with me to discuss this is the legal analyst and author, Ronald Chapman. Ronald, thank you very much for joining me. The First Amendment in America is very powerful, isn't it? Unlike in this country, where you can't discuss a court case, in the US, people have much greater liberty to discuss court cases.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the exact right that is pitted against the judge in this case, who has to decide whether or not gagging Donald Trump would be an infringement of his First Amendment right. And that's why you see that the ultimate gag order that was administered by the judge was limited to those things that would have an impact on the outcome of the trial. Statements and threats related to witnesses, things that would prevent them from taking the witness stand, would often be gagged, as opposed to comments about the judge or other members of the prosecution team. The judge carved out Donald Trump's ability to speak about even Alvin Bragg on the campaign trail. And so with this narrow gag order, the judge does have some authority, even with the First Amendment, to issue these fines. We've seen a relatively measured approach so far with lower fines, but they could increase.
And how much is it entirely in the judge's discretion, or can this be appealed to senior courts? Because Trump already has in front of the Supreme Court the question about his immunity from when he was president. Could these fines end up in another endless legal process?
Yes, absolutely they could. Donald Trump has filed a number of appeals to the New York Court of Appeals related to several cases in New York, but the court continues to deny appeals even from this trial, regarding whether the judge is biased and should recuse himself, regarding the gag order and First Amendment protections. Trial courts in the United States get significant leeway to make decisions like this and prevent certain conduct. It's possible that they could be appealed and overturned, but it's unlikely that that would result in a changed outcome for Donald Trump or stop the trial. So yes, he can appeal, but it's unlikely to be successful.
And what's the timeline of the trial? How much longer is it expected to take?
Well, I believe the judge asked the jury what their availability was going to be over the Memorial Day weekend, which usually happens in late May in the United States. That suggests to us that the trial is going to go for several more weeks with testimony and deliberation. And some people may be aware the prosecution gets to go first, and then the defense has the opportunity to call witnesses. But the defense does not need to disclose specifically who they will call in many cases. So depending on the number of witnesses Donald Trump wants to call, this case could go on another 4 or 5 weeks before its conclusion and before the jury begins their decision-making process.
And this makes all the issues around First Amendment rights so much more sensitive, because it's 4 or 5 weeks where Donald Trump, former President Trump, is in court, he can't campaign, he's running for the presidency of the United States, and anything that restricts a candidate for the presidency is an even bigger restraint on freedom of speech than if he were another defendant.
Absolutely. This is the most concerning aspect of the trial. A lot of us are asking the question, why did this have to happen now? We have a relatively minor offense, 34 felony counts, but really the punishment is probation to 4 years in confinement. That is a minor offense in the United States. And we have that blocking up a very important New York court that has to deal with murders and robberies and other cases. We see that this has a tremendous impact on Donald Trump's ability to campaign, and it will surely lead to an argument by him and his constituents, should he lose, that the election was rigged because he was prevented from being on the campaign trail as a result of this judge's requirement. It would have made much more sense to wait for the outcome and then have the trial.
And there are political elements to it, aren't there? That the prosecution comes out of Democrat politics. And I believe the judge made a donation to the Democrat Party or a Democrat candidate albeit a modest one at some point in his career.
I believe so, and I believe his daughter worked for the campaign of a Democrat as well, something that Donald Trump, I believe, highlighted significantly. We do know that there is a federal connection to the prosecutors in this case. Several of them worked for the Department of Justice, the same entity controlled by Joseph Biden and currently prosecuting Donald Trump. There's smoke and a bit of an odor here on this case and the way that it was started. I think the real question will be, what does the jury do? If there's an acquittal for Donald Trump, I think that will go great lengths in terms of Donald Trump arguing that this was an attempt to sway the election.
And isn't it, seems from an English point of view, extraordinary that a judge who's donated to a political party that is opposed to the defendant hasn't recused himself? Is it normal in the US for somebody with a known political bias to remain trying a case of a political opponent?
Typically not normal. Of course, we don't have too many cases with political opponents. I would say in the United States, we really only have two parties. A judge that is elected is likely going to hold a relatively political position and would make campaign donations. I think it would be difficult to find a judge that did not donate to one campaign or the other. And of course, if they donated to a Republican campaign, they'd be biased. If they donated to a Democrat's campaign, they'd be biased. I think this is one of the things that we just have to deal with when we're dealing with the prosecution of a former president of the United States.
Well, brilliant. Thank you, Ronald, for that very clear explanation. Coming up next, I'll be speaking to the teacher who has been busy taking his gender pronoun case to the High Court. Will the High Court rule in favour of free speech and common sense?
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome to Scotland, home of Hamza Yousaf's hate crime law, aka the Clype's Charter.
Clype, a delightfully Scottish word for a grass, a snitch, or in the context of Russell Finley's opening gambit during the hate crime debate at Holyrood last week, reporting your friends, family and neighbours to the police for alleged hate crimes. The SNP responded by doubling down on the new law's ability to protect vulnerable victims.
I am confident that we have robust legislation that will protect those who are vulnerable to harm.
But other victims are emerging in the wake of this new legislation. As the bill moved through Parliament, concerns rose of police inundated with vexatious complaints, targeting individuals who had committed no crimes. The first fortnight of the new law gave rise to nearly 9,000 complaints.
The vast majority, at least 95%, have been deemed not to be crimes.
False reporting is nothing new. A social post from Scottish Conservative Murdo Fraser was flagged by a trans rights activist in November.
Police decided that no crime had been committed, but nevertheless that was recorded as a non-crime hate incident.
And Alba Westminster leader Neil Hanvey says he too has been targeted under pre-existing legislation.
I've been the victim of at least one of those complaints, and that's taken up the time of police officers.
Thick skin can be expected of our elected officials, but what about the public? 74-year-old Morag McDougall-Brown says she was reported to police by a neighbour, and the experience has taken its toll.
I hate to think that anybody like me or similar to my age would ever have to go through this, because I really don't think I will ever go over it.
We're GB News, and we come from a proud tradition of British journalism.
That's why I'm so excited to be here. It's something so new.
The first news channel to be launched in Britain in over 30 years.
Launched to represent the views of the British people.
To go where other broadcasters refuse to go.
How did you find out about the story in the first place?
Launched with one aim.
To be the fearless champion of Britain.
It's an absolutely fantastic atmosphere here.
This is GB News.
GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, every Sunday at 9:30 when I'll be interviewing the key players in British politics and taking them to task.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial.
With an upcoming election looming over Westminster, now is the time for clear, honest answers.
I agree.
And that's precisely what I'll get.
Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's election channel.
Well, we were talking about Palestine protests in universities and Trump, and you've been firing in your mail mogs. Elizabeth said, in a world in which thousands die in Sudan, Yemen, Ethiopia, Syria, China, etc., only when Israel defends itself do leftist students seemingly lose their minds. Why the double standard? It's a very good question, Elizabeth. And Frankie asks me, Jacob, how do you see the Israel-Palestine conflict coming to an end? That's such a difficult question. I think these things just take a very, very long time. And Al, the more Donald Trump is punished by the judicial system, the more it empowers his base. The answer must lie with the people in an election. We've seen some states try and remove his name from ballots, but this would be a disaster and would in itself pave the way for a repeat of the 6th of January. I agree with that. I mean, I think the more they use legal fare against him, the stronger he becomes. In May last year, the Professional Conduct Panel, Teaching Regulation Authority, recommended to the Education Secretary that a maths teacher should be banned from teaching after being found guilty of unacceptable professional conduct. A panel from the Teaching Regulation Agency found Mr. Sutcliffe had not treated his transgender student with dignity or respect after refusing to use his or her pronouns, as well as finding that he inappropriately shared his Christian beliefs with pupils. But Mr. Sutcliffe has taken this decision to ban him from teaching to the High Court, which heard yesterday from his lawyers that this decision was an unjustified interference in his right to free speech and freedom of religion. So what will the High Court make of it? Well, I'm joined now by the man himself, Joshua Sutcliffe. Joshua, first of all, thanks so much for coming in.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
This can't be much fun for you. You're a maths teacher, you want to be teaching maths, not working your way through the law courts.
Oh, I agree with you. I mean, a few times yesterday I was brought to tears. I'm just listening to all the arguments again and, losing the profession that I love. But I'm very happy that in the UK we're able to take our case to the judiciary and hoping for an excellent outcome in the next few weeks or months.
And what led to all this? How did it come about that the Teachers Regulatory Authority decided to take away your right to teach?
Well, again, it was argued yesterday that the fundamental reason was that I didn't want to use the pronouns of a student in my class, and then that has been taken on by the TRA, as you mentioned, as the dogma that must be submitted to. But we're hoping that the judiciary recognise that there are alternative opinions. And of course, we've seen recently in the press the Cass review come out, and it really sort of backs, an alternative perspective.
But was the TRA basically deciding that the law was that gender self-identification was to be followed by teachers?
I would say so, yes. And I think that's why we need to see this case overturned, because it isn't the TRA's decision to assert these sorts of contentious issues into our society. And the school asserted that on me, and then the TRA have asserted it. But hopefully the judiciary recognise that it doesn't need to be that way in our country.
And the Cass review has been very important because a very detailed study has shown the dangers of allowing children to think that they have a different sex or gender.
Well, this was my reservation from the outset, is that it leads children down a very dangerous path, I would suggest, because you go on to take hormones and a range of other things can be implemented, and that was my reservation. But I did always try and consider the student and treat them with dignity and respect. Actually, the finding was that because I didn't use the pronouns, that I didn't treat them with dignity and respect, and that's really where the argument, centres, and as we heard yesterday.
But we now really know from the Cass review that it may in fact be better not to use somebody's pronouns because you may be encouraging an entirely different problem.
Yeah, and I'm really pleased that the medical professionals have backed up that position because, it's the well-being of the young people that's paramount. And it's why I went into teaching, is to help the young people and, and to try and better their life, just to help them and to help them improve with their education and so on. So, no, I'm really pleased that the medical experts have come to that conclusion.
And how strong an influence in the findings against you was your Christian faith?
I do think that the student and other people may have taken that into stronger consideration than was necessary. I was and still am very good at separating my sort of views from my professional conduct. And I do think that because people have seen me in places like this, sat with you, Jacob, that they think that they've kind of made a view about me without actually taking into consideration the facts of the case.
But were you going into class and saying, repent and believe the gospel?
No, of course not. My classes were actually very high performing, and I took great pride in that. And still to this day, if I were to help anyone, I would be confident that the same outcome would be.
It seems quite hard to get religion into a maths lesson.
Well, it's difficult, of course.
Pythagoras was a religious figure of some kind, had very strange religious beliefs.
Did he?
Yes, he did. But other than that, it's not a particularly proselytising environment.
Well, exactly. No, your guess is as good as mine, Jacob. But I do know my differentiation and from my geometry, and I'm good at those things. But aside from that, obviously, I do have a strong Christian conviction.
But this was part of the reason you were banned for teaching from life, was it that you promoted your Christian faith in a school?
It was part of the case was, since you've asked, that I had a conversation with the student who made the allegations against me, and that conversation was something that came to light. My views on marriage, my traditional views of marriage between a man and a woman. But it wasn't really the epicenter of the debate yesterday. It was really around the gender, the pronouns, and those sorts of things. So I would have thought that those other things would have been dismissed by now, because it has been the focus throughout.
And that is the issue of misgendering,
right,
which very helpfully from the Cass report has now been dismissed essentially as a thing, that people have the gender that they're born with. They don't have a gender that they think that they've got because they've decided to change it.
Yes, that's the truth.
Well, that's the truth, and now people are able to say it again without creating a great scandal. But you were very unfortunate to be caught up in the hysteria that there was around allowing self-identification.
I agree with you, Jacob, and I'm really hoping that because of what's come to light in recent months and years, that it's quickly overturned, and I can be free to do what I love if I so choose.
And when do you expect the judgment?
It should be a few months, I'm told, but it's difficult to tell.
OK. Well, yep. I wish you every success and good luck in that, and thank you for coming in, Joshua. That's all from me. Up next, well, it's not quite all from me, because I'm going to be back at 1 o'clock in the morning for the Night Owls, talking about the election. But before that, it's Patrick Christie's. Patrick, what have you got on your bill of fare this evening?
Well, it's very much a show of two halves, Jacob, because I'm starting with the protests outside a migrant hotel today. They blockaded the bus that was supposed to be taking asylum seekers from there to the Bibby Stockholm. So lots of strong stuff from there. And then, obviously, at 10 p.m, the polls do close. So it's local elections, it's by-elections, it's mayoral elections, and we are doing the absolute lot of it. So it's action-packed, blinking you'll miss it stuff all the way from 9 till 11 p.m. tonight, Jacob.
Oh, that's all very exciting, and the election results are going on forever, aren't they? Some of them we won't get until Saturday, I don't think.
Absolutely. So it's a long night for you, Jacob. Possibly a long few days, actually.
Well, possibly, but Patrick, you're always broadcasting, so if it's long for me, it'll be even longer for you. I'll be back tonight, as I said, at 1 o'clock for GB News' election coverage. In case you've forgotten, I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation, and you're waiting for my thoughts on the weather in Somerset for the weekend. I think it's going to be a beautiful bank holiday weekend. Every possible sunbeam will be flooding down on God's Own County so that we enjoy the May Day celebrations.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good evening. It's time for your latest GB News weather update, brought to you by the Met Office. There's going to be quite a bit of rain around tomorrow, but before then, the risk of some heavy thundery downpours overnight, in association with a front that's still lingering across central parts at the moment, and we do still have some blustery conditions because of an area of low pressure over the near continent. But I think it's the thundery downpours across central parts of England into Wales where we're most likely to see any issues. Some of the showery rain will continue as we go overnight, and we'll likely see a few few bursts pushing in from the North Sea further north as well, but many areas towards the northwest of the UK staying dry, some clear skies, but for most a relatively mild start to the day tomorrow. As we go through tomorrow itself, then more rain to come across central parts of England, Wales, and some showers across northern England and into southern Scotland too. Some of these could be heavy and thundery. Lots of cloud and showery rain continuing across many areas, but towards the far north and the far south of the UK, we should have some decent dry and sunny weather. In the sunshine, it will feel quite warm, albeit temperatures not quite as high as they were today. As we look towards the weekend, and well, it is looking pretty messy. On Saturday, there's going to be quite a bit of cloud